Something we hear a lot, Cecilia, here in DC is the idea of a right-left kind of unity. You know, you do see a lot of right-wing praise for Lina Khan and all of that, but it does seem to me fundamentally irreconcilable in the critiques, because at the end of the day, you know, conservatives want to repeal Section 230 or break up Facebook in order to stop censorship. Whereas people like Mark Warner, Richard Blumenthal, you know, these other senators, Amy Klobuchar, they want a lot more censorship. So I'm like, I don't see how this could all come together at the end of the day in an actual enforceable action. What do you think?
So also about a month ago, the House Judiciary Committee passed a suite of antitrust bills. It would be like the most radical change of antitrust laws in decades. If you were to ask me a year ago, even certainly 2 years ago, if that would have gone through and passed in a bipartisan way, generally, I would have said, no way. There's nothing passes, first of all, in Congress. And there's too much disagreement. This is the Republicans are the party of the market. And, Democrats also are just they don't want to potentially do something that's too overburdensome and have, these other unintended consequences. So that was actually a real sign to me that things have changed. I'm not saying things are going to pass quickly or easily in the full House floor or the Senate, and you're going to see a complete sweeping change of antitrust laws. But I do think it's just a matter of time. And again, if history is a guide, let's forget Microsoft for a little bit. If you look at history as a guide, when you look at the biggest antitrust actions of the past century, it just looks sort of inevitable that there will be some sort of change from the outside with laws and regulations.
So here's my big last question. I've been convinced of a lot of things reading your book and just from what you all are articulating here. Once again, to right-leaning listeners, we can debate the effect of Russian interference on the actual election, but I think it's pretty clear that there was a lot of negligence at Facebook that led to there even being that debate in the first place, and that's something we could all acknowledge and recognize. I get the privacy things. Given the fact that Sagar and I are deeply in these spaces, I am just not convinced by the monopoly point itself with Facebook's case. Because the key thing, Lina Khan, she got famous, deservedly so, focusing on Amazon. And I think that when we say big tech antitrust monopoly issues, that actually does a little too much work, and that it actually confuses the actual point, which is right now, I see Facebook, I see TikTok, Twitter is now coming back. Clubhouse was never going to get bought by Facebook in the first place. They rejected Twitter's offer. I'm concerned that our conversation around Facebook being a monopoly, and this is maybe where the judge is coming from, is just stuck in a brief, really negative moment from 2013 to 2016, where Facebook just had the perfect mix of utility power and coolness to do that. As in, wow, I want to blow up Instagram. You know what? Yeah, I'll work off Mark Zuckerberg because he's this great guy who's going to help me build it up. I just don't see that as being true. So that's just the point that I am just the least and y'all are not advocates. It's not your job to convince me. But could you all just respond to the more meta narrative? I just think that's the weakest part of the case right now.
I think that's so smart, Marshall. I think the monopoly argument is a lot of work right now. I think the monopoly argument is meant to solve so many other problems right now in Washington when it comes to disinformation, misinformation. It's really an astute point. And also, these companies are all so different. They all have different business models. So it's I think the sentiment is there. I mean, we've known that for months, many, many months now, that the anger is there and the backlash towards tech. How this is actually executed in terms of reining in these companies in practice, it's really going to be tricky. And the courts essentially said, to your point, the very first question, you haven't even defined clearly and convincingly that it is a monopoly. Show your homework. When you say something's a monopoly, tell us what that looks like. So, yeah. I mean, I think that you're going to see some pushback aside from the political conversation in Washington.
Absolutely. And I remember every time, I have friends who are like, we're going to break up big tech. I'm like, guys, Facebook is a social media company. Twitter is a news aggregator, which is like 7% market share. Apple is a hardware company. And Amazon is a online shopping store. It's like, these are not the same. They have completely different business models. Shira, this is kind of my question from you from a more Silicon Valley perspective and kind of relates to what I just said, which is that Facebook is they have $1 trillion market cap. They're raking in all this money. What do people in Silicon Valley think when they consider the future of tech? Like, is Facebook a part of that conversation? Is Amazon, or are they kind of bygones that they made all their money, but we're moving on? Like, where are they in the conversation?
No, I mean, they're absolutely in the center of conversation. If you're a young Silicon Valley company, you're still modeling yourself after Amazon and Facebook, right? That is still the way they've done business. I hate to say it, but the move fast and break things, that is still very key to the founder startup ethos. And all you have to do is go to one of these incubators and hear the aspiring young startup founders talk about their visions. And, they hang on every word that Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos say about how they do business. I think a lot of Facebook's problems, a lot of the problems in tech companies right now is that, right? It's all about scaling and growth. And if you need to burn money to get there, you burn money to get there. And you really deal with your privacy and security and other problems later. I just wanted to add one thing to Cecilia's previous point, which is like, yes, antitrust, that's like, it's become a catch-all, right? Like, let's talk about monopoly. It's so much harder to talk about misinformation and disinformation. It's so much harder to say, okay, we're a society that values free speech, but do we need limitations on, or define even what free speech is in the age of the internet? Do we create stricter laws about things like, for instance, disenfranchising voters? Like, that is a much more nuanced and complicated conversation to have here in Washington. Do you say, okay, we believe in free speech, but if that speech tells people, gets people to not vote by misinforming them, or gets people to act dangerously in a time of a pandemic, do we need to figure out other, ways to define what our free speech is? That is a very difficult and hard conversation. There are no easy answers in it, but that's the age we're in. And that's a conversation that's applicable to all of except for maybe Apple, to the other companies you just mentioned. Look at the top books on Amazon. There's regularly books on Amazon that are sold and products on Amazon that are part of the misinformation ecosystem and campaign. This touches on all of these companies. I think that the US has to start thinking in a more nuanced and complex way about it.
Yeah. So here's my last actual question for
ahead,
the
Marshall.
two of you, because it directly speaks to what you just said. We've had Senator Josh Hawley on the show. We've had JD Vance on the show, and they are very explicit about believing that the conversation around misinformation and disinformation is just fundamentally in bad faith. And ultimately, this is just about power. Mm-hmm. So the thing that they will cite is
power for who? Power for who?
Well, basically power for the center left and institutions that lean, not like left as in progressive, but just sort of, once again, like the whole point of our show, The Realignment, is this idea that society's polarizing around education and class in those different directions. So just the thing that it's so hard. I mean, Cecilia made the point about studies show this and that thing about censorship. I mean, the problem is, if you're a right-leaning person in this country, it's not the 80s anymore when Ronald Reagan won college graduates. The studies are run by institutions that, it's probably from the Neiman Lab at Harvard, or it's probably at the MIT Media. So it just goes on and on and on. And there's just so little. So I just want to hear, what would you say to people who think this entire conversation is probably just in bad faith and it's really about assuming political power and defeating their enemies? Because the one last thing I'll add here is that JD and Senator Hawley will explicitly say, we on the right need to wield power the same way. So we need to say, look, who cares what this philosophical debate around speech is? Who cares what Section 230 is trying to do? We need to use power the same way the center left uses power. So I'm just curious what y'all's response is to that for our last cue.
I'm kind of curious what that would look like, first of all, for them using power.
So quick example. I mean, this is, once again, these conversations are nascent, so they're not quite coherent. So treat them directionally. Yeah, I had a friend who is at a prominent, well-funded conservative organization. He said, look, if I were in Congress right now and we're telling this to congressmen we lobby, they need to support breaking up Google, not because there's this like Borkian history of this and that. It's like people of that company are enemies. People at Apple are going to oppose trans bathroom laws in North Carolina, Indiana. So we need to go after these people because they're our political opponents. And because we don't control corporations, because we don't see ourselves as dominating in these other spheres, we have to use the power of the state. So that's what they're saying.
I totally get it.
I just want to note one quick thing, and then I'm going to throw this to Cecilia. But Facebook did run an internal study on this. They hired a Republican senator, Senator John Kyle, who was given the first and most comprehensive access to their own platforms to see if there was any legitimacy to claims of conservative bias. And he found that there was not. And that report, including its methodologies on Facebook's platform. I think that, people often cite, why should we trust a study from NYU? Why should we trust a study from name a left-wing leaning institution? And I would point that, we haven't seen studies from any institution along the political spectrum that has conclusively shown conservative bias.
Just the one quick thing to add to that, but that actually gets to what's fascinating here. No one on the right that I'm talking about gives a damn what Senator Kyle says.
Yeah. He's a libertarian.
That's the political dilemma we're in, right? Like that's the post 2015 Republican Party.
I mean, it almost feels a little bit more like a little adjacent, sort of like the problem, what you're describing, which is there's so much lack of trust and lack of faith, as you're saying. There's just like such between the parties. Okay, so on the other side as well, the left would say, oh, well, Hawley is just using this as a political plank because this is like his road to the White House, like it's so politicized. One thing that I think we try to do in our book is to show that once Facebook decided to play in that sandbox of politics, of trying to be neutral, which was just sort of a fool's, chase, it's impossible because once you start playing politics on either side, you just get caught up in the mud fight. I'm sorry, I'm mixing so many metaphors. You get just caught up in this, right? And it's, there's some self-inflicted damage on Facebook's part because of that. There is no goodwill from either party because of that. I can't answer for you what the motivations are of JD Vance and Josh Hawley. I don't know what's in their heads. I also don't know what the motivations are of like their counterparts on the left, But I will say that right now it has become such a politicized conversation. This is like not even policy at this point.
Yes.
It's not even issues. And I think it's going to be really hard to get out of it. But interestingly, because politicians can sometimes be quite astute on strategy, they realize that there lies a shared goal of some sort of action that works well, if you believe this is politics, works well for their constituencies on both sides.
Yeah.